We've been discussing two of the great fantasy world builders of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, and George Lucas, creator of the original Star Wars films. In particular, we've been discussing the impact of ancient mythology on their imaginations, and we found one book in particular to have been the connecting thread, The Golden Bough by Sir George Frazer. George Lucas, it would seem, embraced what he found in Frazer, after an introduction by way of pop anthropologist Joe Campbell, while Professor Tolkien seems to have been put off the subject for a while, due likewise to what he found in Frazer. Last time, Dad proposed that it was Father Francis Morgan who freed young Ronald Tolkien from this hang-up, Tolkien's actual foster father. Now, my father proposes to school me about Tolkien's father in several senses of the word, and then about his father's father in the faith, St. John Henry Newman. And then about how C.S. Lewis and George Lucas both come into the mix. Whew. So we better get started. Hello again, I'm Jack, this is my dad, and we'd like to welcome you back once again to another episode of the Popcorn Cathedral. Are you ready to push across the finish line this time?
I think so. This is the third and final episode in our series about the Savior with 1,000 faces. So if you've stuck with us up to now, I feel like it will reward you at the end. So I appreciate you coming back. According to Professor Tolkien himself, according to his own account, his interest in fantasy didn't really develop until his teenage years. The years, that is, when he was being mentored by his foster father, Francis Xavier Morgan, at the Birmingham Oratory. Here's what Tolkien wrote about that. A liking for fairy stories was not a dominant characteristic of my early taste. Before that time, I liked many other things as well or better, such as history, astronomy, botany, grammar, and etymology. And then a little later in the same essay, my real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology, on the threshold of manhood, and quickened to full life by war. Now, did you notice those two words, philology and etymology? Philology, literally the love of words in Greek, is the study of language as it appears in historical sources. And this is what Professor Tolkien ended up doing for a living at Oxford. Etymology, not to be confused with entomology, which is the study of bugs, is studying the origins of words and the way they've changed over time. And Tolkien definitely owed his love of languages to Father Francis Morgan, beginning with his native Spanish, the first non-English language that Tolkien ever learned. Teenage Ronald, as Father Francis called him, had the run of his mentor's library, which was almost entirely Spanish. And in fact, he used the knowledge that he gained there to create one of the first of his many created languages, which he called Nafarine. So that influence of entomology and philology is traceable directly back to Father Francis.
Etymology.
So what did I say?
Entomology.
He may have been interested in entomology too. It's possible. Pretty wide-ranging mind.
Again,
Professor
easy to get the
Tolkien.
two confused. Now, and teenage Father Francis had been the student of Cardinal Newman, so are you basing the whole link to Newman on just that one little factoid?
Well, actually, no. It's not too much to say that Newman mentored Francis Morgan. This is illustrated by the fact that Father Francis became Newman's personal assistant during the last decade of the Cardinal's life. And in fact, Newman sent Father Francis to Rome at one point to represent him at an audience with Pope Leo XIII, when Newman himself had become too elderly to travel. And then Father Francis mentored Tolkien, and not just in theology or languages. As Tolkien also wrote in a letter to his own son later, I first learned charity and forgiveness from him. That may be the major theme in all of Lord of the Rings. You may remember, do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many. So there is a real line of succession, as it were.
And Father Francis learned something about mythology from Cardinal Newman?
Well, to put it shortly, I think Newman cleared the decks for Tolkien by exorcising the ghost of Sir George Fraser. Or to put it another way, to help young Ronald overcome the widespread sense, even in his day, that myth and fantasy, because of their pagan origins, are somehow incompatible with Christianity. John Henry Newman gave the best and fullest answer to all of those who wanted to use comparative religion as a weapon against Orthodox Christianity. And Father Francis shared this good news with his own apprentice.
I'm all ears.
Okay, well, here's how the Spanish Tolkien scholar Diego Blanco explains it. Quote, Cardinal Newman defended, with respect to myths, that there are two sources of divine revelation. The first, normative for the Christian, is the one contained in the Bible. And the other, as a method for preparing the Gentiles to receive the gospel, was reflected throughout history in their myths. In this way, Newman's influence was decisive in Tolkien's decision to create a mythological universe with Catholic roots. End quote.
And how exactly is that supposed to have worked?
Well, one of Newman's contemporaries, G.K. Chesterton, summarized the idea pretty well in a newspaper debate with the skeptic Robert Blatchford, who seems to have got many of his ideas from, you guessed it, the Golden Bough. You've got it there, I think, Jack.
The quote from G.K. here regarding Mr. Blatchford. Mr. Blatchford and his school point out that there are many myths parallel to the Christian story, that there were pagan Christs and red Indian incarnations and Patagonian crucifixions for all I know. But does not Mr. Blatchford see the other side of that fact? If the Christian God really made the human race, would not the human race tend to rumors and perversions of the Christian God? If the center of our life is a certain fact, would not people far from the center have a muddled version of the fact? If we are so made that a Son of God must deliver us, is it odd that Patagonians should dream of a Son of God? When learned skeptics come to me and say, "Are you aware that the Bantu people have a sort of incarnation?" I should reply, speaking as an unlearned person, I don't know. But speaking as a Christian, I should be very much astonished if they hadn't. So what was Newman's contribution to this?
Well, Chesterton's reply to Blatchford might seem to be a clever modern response to the modern problem of comparative religion. But Newman had found the same answer, believe it or not, in some of the very earliest Christian writings in existence. It turns out that there were George Frasers and Joe Campbells in the 2nd and 3rd centuries too, and some of the early Christian apologists responded to their one myth among many line of attack with just this same preparation for the gospel response. It was Newman, after all, who made some of the first translations of the church fathers into English, and certainly the earliest ones that were intended for wide readership by lay people.
And remind us again, who exactly do we mean when we talk about the church fathers?
Well, it's a term that we use for the earliest and most influential church leaders in the early centuries, the next generation, so to speak, after the apostles themselves. It's somewhat similar to the way that we Americans refer to Washington and Jefferson and Madison as the founding fathers of our republic. So you may have heard a few of the names, people like Tertullian and Eusebius and St. Augustine. And it was while preparing his translation of these fathers into English that Newman discovered the lost, or if not lost, then very neglected approach to pagan mythology that had been used by early Christianity. I've said that there were some proto-Campbells in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Some of these, the names of Celsus, Porphyry, Plotinus, Lucian, like Sir George Fraser, 1700 years later, all of these like to point out that there were many pagan Christs that abounded in the mythology of all nations. Adonis of the Greeks, Perseus, who was virgin born, Osiris, who rose from the dead, Bellerophon, who ascended into heaven, etc., etc. It was not uncommon. So Joe Campbell was behind the times in many ways. But here was the thing, to the pagans, from their perspective, here were these Christians talking about Jesus as a real man, living in a certain city that they could find on a map, in a certain country, not really much longer than one long lifetime earlier. And yet it seemed clear to them, to the pagan thinkers, that their Christ was just one more example of the typical mythological avatar that they found everywhere. Just another Icarus or Heracles. Just one more corn king who dies and rises again, bearing much fruit. Well, this is where one of the fathers, and maybe the most important of the very early ones, St. Justin Martyr, comes in. Justin had been a pagan philosopher himself, and who was converted to Christianity about the year 140 AD, only 100 or so years after the death of Christ, in other words. Justin had been a follower of Plato, and he conceived an earnest desire to go back and win his former colleagues to Christ, just as he had been converted. And there were other early leaders doing this as well. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Athenagoras, so forth. One way of thinking about it, if Peter and Paul went to the Jews with the message, these men specialized in the appeal to the Greeks. So their line was Christianity just an imitation of paganism? No, actually, it's the other way around. And I think you've got a good quote from Justin.
I do. It's right here. So, from St. Justin, I maintain that whatever either of our lawgivers or philosophers uttered well, they elaborated by finding and contemplating some part of the word. But since they did not know the whole of the word, which is Christ, they often contradicted themselves. For all these writers were able to see realities darkly through the sowing of the implanted word that was in them. It was the work of divine providence on your behalf that they, though often unconsciously, bore testimony to what the prophets said regarding one God. It is not, mind you, that we Christians hold the same opinions as your poets, but that all speak in imitation of ours.
Well, that's an amazing, especially for so very early in Christian history.
This will be the 2nd century?
Yes, that's right, middle of the 2nd century.
Yeah, very early.
So Tolkien got this idea from Newman via Father Francis Morgan, and then got an opportunity to take up Justin's old mission himself. How did that happen? Well, one particular instance that we know of was very influential. That's when he met C.S. Lewis at Oxford in 1926. Lewis was already a great myth lover himself. In fact, his special delight was Norse mythology, which of course was Tolkien's great love. So the two of them hit it off immediately. It also became common ground between Lewis and Tolkien's friend Hugo Dyson, another fellow of Merton College, Oxford. So they're all lovers of myth, yes, but Tolkien and Dyson were also Christians, while Lewis at this time
Still an atheist.
Still considered himself to be an atheist. You remember our letter that we read last time, where Lewis said, all religions, that is, all mythologies, are merely man's own invention, Christ as much as Loki. Well, a little later, in the summer of 1931, this myth-loving trio of Lewis, Tolkien, and Dyson stayed up late one night making laps around Addison's Walk, which is a delightful nature trail behind Magdalen College in Oxford. And I think Addison was an English poet of the 17th century. But for Tolkien, this was also a walk in St. Justin's footsteps, as I think you'll see. We've got Lewis's account of what happened.
What Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a god sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving god, Balder, Adonis, or Bacchus, similarly moved me provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in the pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant.
Well, here's the point at which Tolkien really shows what he learned from Newman. There's a quote here from Tolkien himself.
All right, I got another one. We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of true light, the eternal truth that is with God. We should therefore expect to find in the imaginations of the great pagan teachers and mythmakers some glimpse of the theme which Christians believe to be the very plot of the whole cosmic story, the theme of incarnation, death, and rebirth.
Well, this was an earthquake in Lewis's mental landscape. The next day, he wrote a letter also to Arthur Greeves, same long-standing friend of his to whom he had addressed the atheistic letter, explaining what he had learned on Addison's Walk. Go ahead.
On this theory, the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as he found there. While Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things, myth gradually becomes fact. Therefore, according to Tolkien and Dyson, we shouldn't be shocked to find parallels and pagan Christs. On this theory, they ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't.
Well, a few years later, Lewis encapsulated in a polished form the whole idea in a great essay called Myth Became Fact. And we've got a little excerpt from that.
God sent the human race what I call good dreams. I mean those queer stories scattered all through heathen religions about a God who dies and comes to life again, and by his death has somehow given new life to men. The heart of Christianity is that these myths are now also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, has come down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history.
Well, obviously, Lewis was not far from the kingdom at this point, and in fact, he did become a Christian believer not long after that memorable night on Addison's Walk. And then he went on to become a great Christian myth maker himself. Jack, I think you've read some of these books. The Chronicles of Narnia.
Certainly. The big one, definitely. Narnia is just terrific, absolutely.
Space Children, not Space Children, that's a great 50s science fiction movie. The Space Trilogy.
His Space Trilogy.
That's right. And also, often forgotten and neglected, Lewis's wonderful retelling of the ancient Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche. That book is called Till We Have Faces. Not one of his better-known books, but an amazing piece of work. So, anyway, all this invites the question, does God still send these good dreams? I think that's a deep subject, maybe too deep for this episode. I think it requires at least one episode of its own, but we'll wait and do that later. I will give you a spoiler, though. I think he does give them, which I think is where George Lucas comes back into our story here, right at the end.
Now, how do you mean? Are you saying you think maybe George Lucas also followed Tolkien's thoughts back to Newman or even to St. Justin and the rest?
Well, there's no way to know. George Lucas is very famous for playing his cards close to his vest when it comes to his private life and his personal thoughts, and I understand that. I will say that for a supposed Buddhist Methodist, as he called himself, George sounds a lot more like a Methodist these days, in recent years. Unlike Fraser, who dropped his Calvinism and never looked back, or Joe Campbell, who abandoned his Irish Catholic background for Buddhism. Buddhism, for instance, is explicitly atheistic. As a recent Buddhist apologist put it, the Buddha, like modern sociologists and psychologists, believed that religious ideas, and especially the God idea, have their origin in fear. The Buddha says, gripped by fear, men go to the sacred mountains, sacred groves, sacred trees and shrines. And then, sounding very much like Fraser indeed, this apologist continues, primitive man found himself in a dangerous, hostile world. Fear of wild animals, of not being able to find enough food, of injury or disease. Finding no security, he created the idea of gods in order to give him comfort in good times, courage in times of danger, and consolation when things went wrong.
I kind of feel like that's too dismissive and kind of a little naive, to be honest. I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Well, I don't know that all of that's actually attributable to the Buddha himself, but at least this particular apologist chose to phrase it that way for modern people. But contrast this with George's very emphatic position at the time of the Bill Moyers interview, about the time that The Phantom Menace came out.
I love this quote. Here's George. I put the Force into the movies in order to try to awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people. More a belief in God than any belief in any particular, religious system.
Wait a second. He put the Force into the movies to awaken a belief in God in young people.
His words verbatim.
Okay. All right. Keep going.
I mean, the real question is to ask the question. Because if you having enough interest in the mysteries of life to ask the questions, is there a God or is there not a God? That's, for me, the worst thing that can happen. If you asked a young person, is there a God, and they shrug and say, I don't know, well, I think you should have an opinion about that. And then Bill comes in. Do you have an opinion, or are you looking? George replies, well, I think there is a God, no question. What that God is, or what we know about that God, I'm not sure.
Well, that's actually a pretty rational point to be at least for a while.
For sure.
Interesting. There is a God, no question. Well, that's...
his words, not ours.
That's right. Pretty shaky, though, as an expression of Buddhism. So I'll just conclude by saying that there seems to me to be a definite progression from Empire Strikes Back, with its pretty straight-up Eastern religion, and the much more Judeo-Christian point of view that we find in the later films, or I think we do anyway. We hear, for example, that the Force has a will by the time we get to The Phantom Menace, and only a person can have a will. But anyway, we'll save that for another day. There's an interesting discussion there. But for now, let's just wrap up.
That's a lot of stuff.
A lot to think about.
In just a short period of time of 3 videos, but it's really good. I love it.
Well, hopefully we haven't baked your noodle too bad. So, though I want to say this, I want to offer a little bit of a disclaimer at this point. Though Jack and I are both Catholic, and we've talked about a lot of Catholic stuff in these last few episodes, I want to take a moment to stress that this is not a YouTube for Catholics, or not strictly for Catholics anyway. I think our aim here is to talk about geeky topics in an interesting way from a broadly Christian point of view. In saying that, I don't mean that we're going to water everything down to the point that becomes a lot of mush. That wouldn't be interesting to us or to you. But we do want to make it clear that the Popcorn Cathedral is for everybody.
The doors of the Popcorn Cathedral are open to all truth seekers.
There we go. Not just for Christians, but for anybody who might like to hear an interesting, uncommon point of view. So, or what we think is interesting and uncommon anyway. So, anyway, you'll be the judge, and I hope you will let us know if we ever violate our stated intention here to be nice to you and speak politely. So, also, we'll do the usual drill here at the end. Help us spread the word. Like, subscribe, and comment. And, if you have Christian friends who share the predisposition, then clue them into Christians talking about nerd stuff in a very strange and peculiar way. So, but until then, we hope you'll join us again next time. And for now, God bless.
See you guys.